It's my pleasure to co-host for you today here in Palm Springs. My co-host is Dr. Mitch Li, the founder and president of Take Medicine Back. And I would like to extend to each of you a very warm welcome and thank you so much for being here with us today. We appreciate you taking the time off of your busy schedule to join us. Now, we hope that the exciting program that we have lined up for you today will be engaging and impactful. Each of you is here because you know that what you do matters. What you put your time and your energy into matters to your patients, to your clients, to your family, your friends, and to each other. The purpose of this event today is to bring together leading voices in the fields of medicine, law, and politics to work together to once and for all eliminate corporate interference and restore patient relationship. The profession of law has broadly upheld prohibitions on the corporate practice of law to maintain the sanctity of the attorney-client relationship. Why then has the Federal Trade Commission of the 1970s prohibited doctors from doing the same thing for the physician-patient relationship, specifically preventing the profession of medicine from enforcing standards of professional ethics? You'll find out from our speakers today. Why are there federal programs that incentivize consolidation and vertical integration when both are known to harm patients? You'll find out from our speakers today. Why have state attorneys general, including here in California, failed to enforce existing prohibitions on the corporate practice of medicine that were meant to protect the public, or to investigate the contractual schemes used to circumvent law, including the so-called friendly physician arrangements and stock transfer restriction agreements? You know what it's called when you work around a law instead of abiding by it? It's called being a criminal. So why has the State Attorney General of California failed to investigate corporations and hospitals in California who, instead of abiding by the law, seek to circumvent it? You'll find out from our speakers today. Why is there no federal prohibition on the corporate practice of medicine as a requirement of federal funding, especially when state prohibitions have so widely failed to protect the public? You'll find out today from our speakers. Why are there no significant federal protections of physician due process rights, including passage of the ER Hero and Patient Safety Act, to protect doctors who are fired, disciplined, or not hired simply for speaking up for the quality of patient care? You'll find out from our speakers today. And finally, why have physicians today, many physicians, failed to recognize the existential threat that the corporate practice of medicine holds to our profession and our patients? With that, I would like to turn over the mic to my good friend, Dr. Mitch Li of Take Medicine Back.
Thanks, Jesse. Thank you guys for joining today. Super excited. Just going to do a really quick introduction and sort of set the stage from a historical perspective. First of all, Take Medicine Back would not be here if it weren't for the American Academy of Emergency Medicine, which started this fight 30 years ago after there was a recognition that some leaders in the specialty were creating a business model that essentially commoditized the rest of us, which followed the 1970s actions, commoditizing the profession of medicine. And since then, businesses, including hospitals and private equity firms, have taken that to the next level, and we're reaching a crisis point there. Just a really brief overview of history, if anyone's familiar with the Gilded Age, the actual Gilded Age from over 100 years ago at the end of the 1800s and early 1900s. This is the HBO series, which I've gotten through 3/4 of an episode. I'm not hooked, but it's in pop culture right now. So a lot of people think that we're in a new Gilded Age, and I'm among them. This is a pretty historically popular, iconic image from the early 1900s at the beginning of the antitrust movement. So there was a recognition that there was extremes of wealth, poverty, and equity back 100 years ago, and maybe that sounds familiar to where we are at today. So there were a few societal responses to this. One was the labor movement. One was the antitrust movement, which we don't really talk about trust today, but we talk about the antitrust movement, which is confusing because it's really the anti-monopoly or pro-competition movement. And there was the corporate practice of medicine doctrine, which was created by this profession. And we don't talk about that one as much. So the American Medical Association says that the corporate practice of medicine concept dates back to the 19th century and was integral to elevating the medical profession and ensuring the autonomy of physicians and providing an ethical basis for the practice of medicine. So, meanwhile, the AMA today says you can enter into whatever contractual agreement we want to, and they even give you a guide on how to sell your practice out. So, something is wrong with that picture. If this was so integral to the ethical basis of our profession, maybe it's time to go back there, and I think there's others that agree with us at this point. This is, we've got the authors of this article in New England Journal of Medicine. 34 or so states enacted state medical practice acts, various degrees of prohibitions on the corporate practice of medicine that were based on the doctrine that basically said physicians should not be influenced or controlled by corporate lay interests, meaning corporations that are not licensed to practice medicine, which is all corporations unless they're composed of physicians. Labor movement, as mentioned, we're seeing that. We've got a lot of union people here. We'll be talking on that one. And this is somebody iconic from the from the movement, a Supreme Court justice, early 1900s, who said that we can have democracy or we can have concentrated power in the hands of the few, but we can't have both. And this refers to government, but it also refers to corporations. So we're not here to say that it's all government, it's all corporations. It's really concentrated power anywhere. And that's what we're seeing right now. It's really consistent with our philosophy. I'm going to skip over this. The antitrust paradox gets a little wonky, but in the 1970s, we had this change in our nation's, how we interacted with antitrust law that's led to a lot of this commoditization and consolidation. That led to HMOs, which was the idea that the nation's MBAs and business people were going to make medicine much more ethical and equitable. And so here we are with healthcare costing 4 times as much as it did in 1980 as a percentage of the GDP because we have commoditized physicians. And our salaries did go down, but that has not translated to lower costs for patients. We have the Envision lawsuit. You'll hear more about that today. So there's movements here. This is a book from James Keeney in the 1990s, named in a 1990s way, but really, so we'll call it the pillage of emergency medicine. This was integral to moving and changing where we are today with the American Academy of Emergency Medicine and our group, Take Medicine Back. So this is our white paper. You can check it on our website. We are now taking applications to become founding members for the 501c3 that we're forming. We're a public benefit company right now. So at our website, takemedicineback.org, you can do that. Physician members at this point, and we'll have supporting members, and that'll help us with all the startup costs and forming this, including our website. And then you're going to hear from the rest of these folks because we were working on this corporate practice of medicine thing started by Dr. McNamara and James Keeney long ago, but at the same time we did that, so we're a bunch of lawyers and policymakers, and they're here today, so you'll hear from all of us. And is Dr. Jones? There he is. Okay, we're going to introduce Dr. Jones, the president of the American Academy of Emergency Medicine. I'll hand that over to you, and we'll get started with our keynote speakers soon.
Fantastic. Got him. Thank you, Dr. Li. And now it is my pleasure to introduce to you all the president of the American Academy of Emergency Medicine. Here to give his opening remarks, Dr. Jonathan Jones. Dr. Jones.
Thanks, Jesse. Thanks, Mitch. Good to see everybody here. I'll just take a few minutes. So as Mitch mentioned, I think a lot of this was spearheaded by my predecessors as presidents of AAEM. This has been the core mission of the American Academy of Emergency Medicine for our entire existence. And I'm proud to help continue that and not continue that, but to expand that with Take Medicine's Back assistance. And so I'll talk just a little bit. We don't need to go through all these slides, but this is, I think, sums up what AAEM is committed to, a future in which neither patients nor physicians are subjected to non-physician interference, right? I think that's why we're here. As was already mentioned by Jesse, by Mitch, the doctor-patient relationship. That is the core of what we do. That's why we went into this profession, and that's being eroded every day. And so we need to get back to that, and that's why our academy exists, is simply that. We have a lot of stuff. So private equity and consolidation, I'm just going to say a few things. So corporate practice in medicine is bad. I think, yeah? Okay, good. It's good when you have a audience that you can connect with, right? But it's gotten worse. I mean, the corporate practice in medicine, as just went over, the prohibitions against it have existed for a long time, but so has the practice of it has existed for a long time. And I'm not going to say everything was fine, because it wasn't. It was bad. But you know what? It can get worse, and it has gotten worse. And so that's what private equity-backed corporate practice in medicine is worse, right? Because now it's short-term thinking, as opposed to just taking the profits and keep them going and taking advantage of the patients and the doctors. Now it's, let's get as much as we can in the next 2 to 3 years and then run this into the ground as fast as we can. And now it's consolidated private equity-backed corporate practice in medicine is what we're dealing with now. Okay, so despite the 30 years of AAEM working on this, the situation's only gotten worse. But as we all know, sometimes you have to hit that bottom. Sometimes you have to get to that nadir where you can finally rise. And I hate to say it, but if you ask the average patient, right, 10 years ago, what corporate practice medicine was, what private equity was, how many of them would have known anything about that? Almost none. And it's because it didn't directly affect them. And they are finally seeing it affect them. I'm not going to be the first person to say this, and you can shoot me down. I know I just said it's a friendly audience, but COVID did some really good things, okay? And one of the things is it shed a light on staffing and management and consolidation and corporate practice of hospitals. And that's the last good thing I'm going to say about COVID. But you got to take advantage. You have to take advantage of devastations. Okay, you have to turn a bad into a good, and that's what we're doing in the American Academy of Emergency Medicine. That's what Take Medicine Back is doing. So I just wanted to do with that. These are the things that corporate practice of medicine affects. It's not just us and our patients. It's actual national security. Just 2 weeks ago, I had a call with the Department of Homeland Security about the consolidation in healthcare. And if all of our hospitals, all of our emergency departments are now run by one company, and okay, no, it's not one, but right by a select handful of companies. And what if we have a national disaster? What if there's a war? What if something bad happens? Is this actually a threat to national security? When Mitch first put me in touch with Homeland Security, I said, what in the world do you want me to talk to Homeland Security about? Okay, but it's true. So this is not just us and our patients. We need to think well outside the box, and that's what Take Medicine Back is doing. And so I applaud Take Medicine Back and everybody that's worked so hard with Take Medicine Back by expanding this. And it's not just doctors and patients. It's not just the emergency department. Obviously, I'm an emergency physician. That's what I care about the most. But it is not just the ED. It is the entire hospital. It is our profession. It is the health of this country. And I'm not just talking about the physical health. I'm talking about just our health, our ability to be an ongoing concern as a country. If we can't manage our healthcare concerns, then we don't have anything. We'll talk about that Envision bankruptcy and the lawsuit. We have a lot of good state stuff. I do want to I have to put a plug in for if you're an emergency physician, or if not, please, if you want to keep this conversation going after this talk, come this spring to our annual conference. It's in Austin, Texas this year. We're going to continue a lot of the things we're talking about here. And then I do want to just add one last thing on due process, which is not exactly corporate practice in medicine, but it's obviously very, very tied to it. So for years, a decade now, the American Academy of Emergency Medicine has been fighting to get a federal prohibition on allowing physicians to waive due process rights. So long story short, the federal government says you have to have due process rights as a physician to engage with CMS. but those can be waived. And so all of these third-party contracts, all of these corporate entities force the physicians to waive their due process rights, or you can't work there. So effectively, physicians, particularly emergency physicians, have all been forced to waive due process. We've been fighting to get this changed. We've had bills dropped again and again, and unfortunately, they don't go anywhere. Just received word this past week, February 26th, in the Senate, Roger Marshall and Elizabeth Warren are going to drop again a process to ensure due process for all physicians. So be on the lookout for that. So I think that's a great thing. I'm going to clap for myself. The last thing I want to add on that, the original name of the act was the ER Patient and Hero Safety Act. I'm very proud to say that after discussions with both offices, it is not only going to apply to emergency physicians. It will apply to all physicians. Having the act dropped is the beginning. We have supporters in the House, but we're going to need your help and everybody's help to get this across the finish line. And then the thing that makes me so optimistic about all of this, not just that act and this is, but this is a issue that brings all of us together. This is not a partisan issue. This is not a Republican or a Democrat issue. This is not a liberal or conservative issue. We have union people, we have capitalists, we have everything in between. That's great. This is a healthcare issue. This is when you get sick and go to the hospital, what type of hospital do you want to go to? Where do you want your family to go to? Who do you want making decisions for your family? I think nothing better exemplifies that, honestly, than the two senators that we have that are co-sponsoring this. They're about as opposite sides of the spectrum as you can get, and they agree on this. I mean, this is a wonderful concept, and we just need to get the word out more because nobody, other than the fat cats that were in that first picture, disagrees with this concept. So thank you for being here. Thank you for fighting. I'm here to support you, and I'm very excited to be at this event. So thank you, Mitch. Thank you, Jesse.
Guys, we were going, come on, hot seat, I guess. So we were going to, and we will play a video from Katie Porter, essentially a whiteboard breakdown on the corporate practice of medicine. We're just working on tech issues, so I can share screen. We're going to do that after Brendan Ballou. So we'll start with our keynote speaker, Brendan Ballou, JD, author of Plunder, Private Equity's Plan to Pillage America, and also a Department of Justice federal prosecutor, but not speaking on behalf of the Department of Justice, but I am gonna still point that out because it's also badass. So Brendan has been featured on an awful lot of podcasts. If you listen to like Freakonomics and all those kinds of things, talking about corporate practice of medicine, but also private equity across the board. He also is, you said this publicly on podcasts, is dating a veterinarian. And so he's also looked at, we have veterinarians joining us virtually and in person here. There's a corporate practice of pretty much all the professions are being taken over by private equity firms and really financialized. So we're going to open up with Brendan Ballou's talk on private equity. We'll have Dr. Sailesh Konda moderate some questions afterwards, and then we'll get a video on CPOM. And keeping in mind that we are a nonpartisan group, but with bipartisan solutions. So we do have some videos from Democrats, but we're also in California, and that's where we are. So without further ado, Brendan Ballou, thank you very much.
And do we want to bring Sailesh up too?
You can,
okay?
Yeah, you can stay up there.
They're pitching this as me as giving a keynote, but this is really a duo here. So do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Sailesh Konda. I'm a faculty at University of Florida in Gainesville. And I'm a dermatologist and Mohs surgeon, been there for about 9 years. And I've done some extensive research in private equity and dermatology specifically since about 2017 and 2018. And then got looped in with Mitch and the rest of the gang about 3 years ago. So
great. And I'm going to try to talk into the microphone because I understand that there are a fair number of people that are online watching this. Well, first off, thank you so much for coming out at 8:15 in the morning on a Saturday. This is horrifying for me as a lawyer, but I guess you guys are doctors and are used to getting less sleep than I do. So thank you for your time. As Mitch mentioned, I'm obviously speaking in a purely personal capacity here. We sort of initially discussed this as a speech, but I think, as I said, this is going to be more of a duo and a conversation here. I want to talk a little bit about the private equity business model generally and why it often leads to bad consequences. And then I'm hoping to pass it off and maybe you can talk a little bit more about the effects in healthcare specifically, and it can become more of a dialogue. I should also say, this isn't to blow smoke, but the reason that I came out here was not to give this talk, but really to hear from all of you. There is just a wealth of knowledge in this room, and I can read the public reporting and the legal briefs and all of that, but you guys are the medical experts and the professionals, and so I'm hoping that we can have not just a Q&A in this panel, but please let's talk in the corridor or in the breakout sessions. I am very easy to reach. It's just my first name dot my last name at gmail.com. So if we don't get a chance to talk, please reach out to me because I want to hear your stories and understand what's happening to the medical profession right now. So why don't we start off with some basics? I confess, I did this whole project on private equity. I didn't know really what private equity was until after I got the book deal. So is anybody willing to raise their hand? Does anybody not fully understand what private equity is? Maybe you've heard the term, but the specific business model, is anybody willing to be brave enough on that? Okay, we got a room of experts here. Nobody's gonna raise their hands. Well, let me start off with just the basics and then we'll build up from there. So the basic business model of private equity is very simple. Private equity firms take a little bit of their own money, maybe 1 or 2% of the acquisition cost for buying up a business. Some investor money, so that'll be money from a pension fund, a sovereign wealth fund, maybe a foundation or some wealthy individuals. And then a whole lot of borrowed money to buy up companies. And the really important trick here to understand, I shouldn't call it a trick, but really the tactic here that distinguishes private equity is when they use all this debt to buy up the business, it's not the private equity firm that's responsible for paying the debt, it's the business that they buy. So when KKR and Bain and Vornado spend several $1 billion to buy up Toys R Us, or when Carlyle buys up the nursing home chain ManorCare, which I'll talk about in a little bit, spends billions of dollars on these acquisitions, most of that money is money that Toys R Us or ManorCare is going to be responsible for paying. It's a little bit like getting to use somebody else's credit card. So private equity firms use this debt to buy up businesses and then try to flip the business for a profit, generally a few years later after making some financial or operational changes. It's a very simple business model, and it's one that has been tremendously successful and increasingly pervasive. In 2021, private equity firms spent, I think, close to or over $1 trillion on acquisitions in the United States alone. So the entire US GDP is about $25 trillion. That's a bit of an apples to oranges comparison, but it gives you at least a rough sense of scale here. And they're moving in virtually every part of the economy. And they're actually, interestingly, moving beyond the business of private equity, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But if you're in this conference, you know that private equity acquisitions often have very bad results. There's the famous nursing home study saying that private equity acquisitions in that industry are responsible for an estimated 20,000 premature deaths over less than a 20-year period. In the retail industry, private equity firms and hedge funds lost 600,000 jobs over a 10-year period, nearly 600,000, at the same time as the industry as a whole was actually gaining jobs. And on average, private equity portfolio companies, so the companies they buy, are 10 times as likely to go bankrupt as similarly situated businesses that aren't bought up by private equity firms. Very interesting. So why is that? Why do you often have bad consequences across industries? I think in the public reporting on this, there's often a focus on the people in the private equity firms. They say, you know, the supporters of private equity see these guys are masters of the universe. The critics of private equity say, you know, they're evil geniuses. They're, you know, cartoon, you know, they're Mr. Burns characters or something like that. I've talked to a lot of folks in private equity. I think by and large, they are very friendly, very nice people. They take their kids to soccer practice. I don't think I think the public focus on the people in private equity kind of misses the point because it suggests that the solution is to swap out the people and it'll solve the problem. And I don't think that's quite right. I think what's going on here is structural. Private equity firms and private equity executives are responding to the incentives that surround them because of laws and regulations that we've created. I always say, you know, lawyers like myself invent a bad business model every 20 years. You know, right now it's private equity firms. 20 years ago, it was subprime lenders. 40 years ago, it was S&L. 60 years ago, it was conglomerates. 100 years ago, it was trusts. It's just something we do. It's in our DNA. And then there's a crisis, and then hopefully something gets fixed. So what are the incentives, or what are the structural problems that we've got with the business model? I would argue that there are three basic issues. First is private equity firms invest for the short term. So they tend to buy up companies for 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, very short period of time. And that changes your perspective, how you're going to treat the business. If you are trying to make a profit or increase your profit in 3 years, are you going to invest in R&D? Are you going to invest in infrastructure? Are you going to invest in your employees or in your customers? Maybe, maybe not. Second problem, sort of alluded to it when we were talking about the business model, is reliance on debt and fees. So we already talked about private equity firms using debt to buy up these companies, you know, maybe making up 80% of the acquisition. At the same time as they're loading up debt on the company, they are able to extract fees from the business. So management fees, which the portfolio company pays for the privilege of being owned by the private equity firm, or transaction fees, which when the portfolio company sells off a key asset, a percentage of that will go back to the private equity firm. And the really interesting thing is these fees don't go to all the owners of the business. They don't go to the pension funds and the sovereign wealth funds and the foundations and the wealthy individuals. These fees solely go to the private equity firm. And so as the company is getting loaded up with debt, the private equity firm is able to take money out of the business. The third problem, and at some level, I think it's the least covered of the problems with private equity or the private equity business model, but it's potentially the most important, is private equity firms are extraordinarily successful at insulating themselves from the consequences of their portfolio company's actions. So if something goes wrong at a portfolio company, even if it is the direct or indirect consequence of a directive of the private equity firm, it is often very hard to hold that private equity firm responsible. So how does that play out in practice? I alluded just a minute ago to HCR Manor Care, which was at one point the second largest nursing home chain in the United States. In 2007, the Carlyle Group bought up Manor Care, executed a number of tactics that are now sort of familiar. You guys may be aware of some of these, like a sale leaseback, where they required Manor Care to sell off all the real estate for its nursing home chain and then lease it back to itself, which obviously generates a quick hit of cash. But now it's like a reverse mortgage. Now you're responsible. You no longer have that asset. You're going to actually have to pay a lease on that asset. Cut staffing, health code violations spike, resident complaints spike. One resident at a facility dies, allegedly because of understaffing. She has to go to the bathroom by herself. She slips and falls, hits her head on a bathroom fixture. She dies of subdural hematoma. When her family sues Carlyle for wrongful death, Carlyle's able to get the case against it dismissed. And what they do is they argue that we're not the technical owners of the nursing home chain. We just advise a series of funds whose limited partners through several shell companies own the nursing home chain. And that's enough to get the case against it dismissed. And Carlyle was not held responsible for the actions at that nursing home center. So that's one illustration of how private equity firms can escape liability. Let me give you one other one, which is the diner chain Friendly's. Or if any of you guys are from the Northeast, okay, I see one person nodding. He remembers this. So this was like a American fare diner. It'd be like a Steak and Shake or Culver's if you're from the South or the Midwest or something like that. It had this really inspiring story. It was these two brothers, Curtis and Presley Blake, who started the chain back during the Great Depression. It was an ice cream chain initially, and they sold cones for 5 cents a cone. And one brother would work overnight making the ice cream while the other brother would stay up during the day to sell it. And they would take shifts doing that. They closed down their store during World War II they said, we'll come back when we win the war. It was this really kind of inspiring sort of all-American story. They turned Friendly's into this massive national success, this huge chain. Ultimately, it sold to Sun Capital, I believe in 2007. Sun Capital executes a lot of the sort of familiar tactics for private equity. Staffing is cut. Ultimately, they push Friendly's into bankruptcy. When they do that, they have this really interesting tactic going on, which is they weren't just Friendly's owner, they were also Friendly's largest lender. And if you're familiar with the bankruptcy process for corporations, it's a little bit like an hourglass where the roles of the owners and the lenders sort of flip. And so by being on both ends of the hourglass there, Sun Capital was able to sell Friendly's from itself to itself. Now, why would you do that? Why would you go through that complicated process? The reason that you could is through bankruptcy, Sun Capital was able to push the pension obligations that Friendly's had onto what are called the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, which is this quasi-government agency that ensures unfunded or underfunded pensions. And so now Sun Capital was able to continue to own Friendly's, free and clear the obligations that it once had to its employees and to its retirees. And so you contrast the perspectives of Sun Capital with the Blake brothers, who say, we're going to come back when we win the war. The co-founder of Sun Capital gets asked, well, what do you think of this process? Doesn't it seem a little unfair to workers that you're able to abandon the pension fund obligations? And this is a quote or a near quote. The co-founder says, we don't make the rules. So one thing that I mentioned earlier is that private equity firms are increasingly moving beyond private equity. And this may be of relevance to you all as medical professionals. So after the Great Recession, or during the Great Recession, all the big investment banks converted into what are called bank holding companies, which are regulated by the Federal Reserve and have higher capital requirements. They sort of just became culturally much more conservative institutions. And it's a little bit like pushing down on a balloon. As the regulation on investment banks became more intense, a lot of the energy and innovation in the finance industry moved to private equity firms, which are vastly less regulated. There's a really interesting statistic, it's a few years old now, but they did a comparison of employees at, I believe, Blackstone and KKR, which are two leading private equity firms, and Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, two leading investment banks. And these are rough numbers, but it was something like 20% of the private equity employees had worked at one of the investment banks, whereas 2% of the investment bank employees had worked at the private equity firms. And so what that means is all the energy, all the brains of Wall Street are moving to private equity firms. There's this quote from an industry analyst who said something along the lines of, Blackstone reminds me of Goldman Sachs 10 years ago. And wherever something interesting is happening, that's where they are. And you can see that in the numbers. Blackstone just became the largest private equity firm in the world with $1 trillion in assets under management. So what does that mean for where private equity is going? what we've been talking about are sometimes referred to as leverage buyouts, using leverage or debt to buy out companies. That's taking up less and less of private equity firms' businesses and is actually becoming a minority part of many of their businesses. One area where they're getting increasingly active is private credit. So instead of buying up businesses, they're lending to businesses, which is a business that makes a lot of sense in a world of higher interest rates. Potentially very attractive for financial firms, significantly less regulated than other parts of the finance industry. I can't verify this, but I've read critiques of what's going on in the private credit industry, saying that increasingly private creditors are relying on sort of second-tier ratings agencies to get AAA ratings on debts that then become syndicated to people that may or may not know what they're buying. So that's one area where folks are getting active. Another area where folks are getting active is the insurance market, specifically not what you guys have to deal with, but the life insurance market. So private equity firms need money to buy up to buy up businesses, to fund their various projects. Where are you going to get that money? Historically, that's come from pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, what we've been talking about, but they've kind of tapped out on that money. They're running out of it. So they've turned to buying up these life insurance companies. And the reason you do that is, if you have a life insurance policy, you are paying the company, the life insurer, a premium every month or whatever, that they then get to do with whatever they want, invest in various projects on the understanding that they will then pay your estate when you die. So this gives them sort of a steady flow of cash. And they are moving the assets, as has been publicly reported, to offshore affiliates in Bermuda that have lower capital requirements, which gives the private equity firm sort of more money to play with, but less of a cushion if things go poorly. And the challenge that we've got here is, if things go poorly with an insurance company, the chances are good that it won't actually be the private equity firm that has to pay out. It will actually be these things called state guarantee corporations, which are essentially insurers for insurers. So all the other insurance companies pay into these funds to pay out insolvent life insurance policies. So if one of these Bermuda-based life insurance companies goes bust, becomes insolvent, it may be the state guarantee corporation rather than the private equity firm that has to pay out. So it's sort of a heads I win, tails you lose situation. The last area where private equity firms are getting active or hope to get active soon is, and this will be much closer to home for all of us, is 401ks. So historically, 401k fund managers have not invested in private equity. Rather, presumably your retirement money is overwhelmingly invested in the public stock market or bonds and so forth. Private equity firms have worked hard to get access to 401k funds, and there have been regulatory hurdles stopping that. The last administration issued a letter that sort of did away with a lot of those hurdles. And there's active work now to make sure that private equity firms can increasingly get access to 401k funds. So in the next few years, it's entirely possible that you yourself will be an investor in a private equity firm. So Sailesh is going to talk a lot more about private equity and healthcare. I don't want to step on his toes or anything, but I'll just very briefly mention, some things that you already know, which is that private equity is extraordinarily active in your industry. Whether we're talking about hospitals, medical practices, or things that maybe touch you less directly every day, pharmaceuticals, medical devices, and so forth. To the extent you're interested, Bain, the consulting firm, not Bain Capital, issues a report every year on private equity and healthcare. Very long, it's over 100 pages every year. It may be worth reading just to see sort of the trends that are going on here. And again, I don't want to step on your toes, but I mean, the reporting on this, some of which Sailesh has been involved in, your Bloomberg story, I thought was just incredible. I'll just give one detail that has always stuck with me, which is private equity firms buying up dermatology clinics, and you remember the needle example? Yeah. I'll just
Sutures.
Yeah. Well, I'll let you tell the story, but it's evocative and suggests that private equity firms may be in a position where directly or indirectly they are making medical decisions, again, with the aim of making a profit in just a few years' time, which may or may not align with the interests of your profession or your patients. So what can be done here at a high level before we talk about healthcare specifically? I actually, I never want to be too optimistic about these things, but I actually think that there's a lot that can be done and a lot that is happening. So in terms of what needs to be done, so abstracting from healthcare, but just talking about private equity generally, it goes back to the three problems that I mentioned earlier. Short-term thinking, reliance on debt and fees, insulation from liability. If you can solve those three problems, private equity can become a much more productive part of our finance system, a much more productive part of our economy. The question is, how do you get there, right? So in a world where, we have divided government, Congress may or may not act on something like this, there's actually a lot of tools that can happen, starting at the federal level, purely from a regulatory perspective. Things that the SEC, the Treasury Department, the Federal Reserve can do to increase transparency, reduce leverage, reduce systemic risk for private equity firms. There's also things that we can do in industry-specific sections. One of the things that is really inspiring to me is watching, and some of you may be paying attention to this, rulemaking at HHS that's going on right now to establish minimum staffing criteria for nursing homes, partly in response to that incredible study about private equity deaths. There is not a federal staffing requirement in nursing homes right now. It's purely state regulated, and that may change in the next year or two. But as much as can be done at the federal level, I would encourage you all, and this is why I'm excited to be here, to be thinking about what states can be doing. And even localities, municipalities, counties, and so forth. We talk about the specific tactics that private equity firms do, over leveraging their company, executing sale leasebacks, doing dividend recapitalizations where they borrow money to pay a dividend to themselves and to their investors. Localities can potentially ban some of these practices, or if not outright ban them, then hold private equity firms responsible when those tactics go poorly. So they say, okay, if you're going to do a leverage buyout for a business that's headquartered or based in our jurisdiction, and you're going to use a lot of debt to do it, okay, you can do that. But if something goes wrong, we are going to hold you responsible for making whole the people in our jurisdiction. You're going to have to pay your employees and your customers back and so forth. There's a lot of intellectual work that needs to be done on that. I think people are just starting to think about this stuff. There really is not model legislation on this yet, on some of these issues. Fortunately, there's a lot of people in this room that are interested in this stuff, and people that that are interested in this stuff. And there are organizations like Take Medicine Back, but also the Private Equity Stakeholder Project, American Economic Liberties Project, Open Markets Institute, Americans for Financial Reform. All of these folks are interested in these things and want to do good work. So to the extent you're interested in these topics, I'd suggest getting involved, getting on these groups' listservs, understand what's happening. My last note is, I wouldn't say one of hope or optimism, but just encouragement here, which is, I think people tend to undervalue or underestimate their own power on some of these issues. I think the challenge of the private equity business model is so pervasive that it can become overwhelming. A sense that this is so all-encompassing in the American economy that really nothing can be done. I suspect, given that you are here at 8-something on a Saturday, that you disagree with that statement, and that you actually believe that something can be done. And I will say, we've seen things get done on specific issues. I already mentioned the nursing home staffing room. That was the result of concentrated advocacy. One of the areas that I've seen the most work done, or the most successful work done, has been on private equity in prisons, where private equity firms are buying up prison phone companies, prison healthcare companies, prison cafeteria companies, and so forth. prison phone companies in particular, they have been buying up the businesses and charging extremely high rates for short 15-minute calls, $15 or more. A few organizations were able to pass local legislation in a couple of cities, then statewide legislation in Connecticut, and now incredibly federal legislation to empower the FCC to do rulemaking on this. And it took time, but it wasn't a huge group. It was a couple of folks that were really focused on this, focused on one issue and focused on it for a period of time. And they had local, state, and now national success. Though the advantage that you guys have is that everybody likes doctors, so you guys are a very sympathetic.
It was a tough crowd there.
Tough crowd. See, this is the problem with me being a lawyer coming here, so. Yeah. Well, I lost the crowd, but but what I'll say is, you guys, I think, nationally are a sympathetic audience, and I mean, I don't mean to be blunt here, but you're a rich audience by comparison. Everybody, I know you all have a lot of medical debt to pay, and emergency medicine, doesn't pay nearly as much as it should. But compared to the folks that were advocating on prison phone calls, you guys have a lot of power. So I would not underestimate your influence here, your ability to make change here, which is, again, why I'm so excited to talk to all of you, and I'm looking forward to having this conversation. Thank you.
And then now I'm going to segue to like a short slide deck I have, and then we'll go to like a Q&A session. Ironically, I'm probably going to step on Brendan's toes because I'm going to be talking some of the regulatory updates happening in the federal level. All right, so can you hear me? Okay. So basically talking about CPOM and then regulatory updates relevant to CPOM as well. So I have no disclosures relevant to this talk. One thing I want to start off with, sounds tangential, but I hope this kind of gives you a mindset for today and this weekend. What's a profession versus what's an occupation? So profession is advanced training institutions, occupations on-the-job training. Professions prolonged education, occupation length of training is not standardized. Profession is curiosity, creativity, thought. Occupation is largely manual work. Profession based on science or theory. Occupation is mainly guided by others. Values, beliefs, ethics are integral part of professions, may not be part of occupations. Strong commitment versus variable commitment. Autonomous versus supervised. Unlikely to change profession. Once you're in it, that's your whole career. Occupations can change every several years. In a profession, you value the commitment more than the monetary reward, hopefully. And in occupation, you're motivated by primarily the reward. And then lastly, with a profession, ultimately you as the individual are ultimately accountable for your decisions and what you do. While in occupation, you kind of blame any issues to your supervisor or those above you. And how many of you guys in this room, raise your hands, consider yourself as a profession for the physicians in the room? That's common sense. I thought all y'all would agree. So we're actually at risk of turning into an occupation with corporate practice of medicine. You can see the more corporatized that we get, we go more from this left column to the right column. That's why everyone in this room should be concerned about corporatization happening in medicine. So where's PE in medicine? Pretty much everywhere. But the hot sectors have been ER, primary care, optho, derm, rads, gastro, dentistry, Aspen Dental, I'm sure you guys heard of, that's a big PE-backed dental group, nephrology, anesthesiology, OB-GYN, fertility is a really big hotspot now, nursing homes, as Brendan alluded to, orthopedics, hospice, and behavioral health is a very hot sector now as well, especially in the telemedicine behavioral health sectors. So I'm not going to delve into this because Brendan already talked a little bit about PE, but essentially, PE firms use a small fraction of their own money, and they use a lot of borrowed money from borrowed debt, borrowed capital. So typically the capital PE firm, limited general partners, put up 30% of the money for a deal, and 70% is debt they borrowed. And they try to improve the prospects, squeeze profits, try to quote unquote improve the financial health of the company, and sell to another firm down the road, or another healthcare entity, or an insurance company. So what are some of the concerns for PE-backed practices? These are just overarching concerns across medicine in general. Leverage buyouts and a finite time horizon for a specific return on an investment. Usually 5 to 7 years, but in medicine we're seeing this happen in about 3 to 5 years, a lot of the flips happening. You can lose autonomy, become cogs and widgets in a bigger system. Not just PE, this can happen in big healthcare systems as well, big hospital systems as well. Leveraging PAs and NPPs, difficult to mix PE and optimal ethical patient care as the goals are inherently conflicted. There's a long-standing history of boom and bust cycles. Every 10 years there's another cycle that happens, usually coinciding with interest rates ebbing and flowing. There's examples of many PE-backed practices, even from the 90s, Phi-Core, Phi-Matrix. There's a lot of histories, seeing a lot of groups getting squeezed right now, some of the ER groups, radiology groups with interest rates increasing. Geographic consolidation can lead to anti-competitive practices and redefine the value of board-certified physicians. And then who's the next owner after the flip, which I'll get to in a couple slides. And then this also divides the generations, those exiting the specialties, looking for an exit strategy, and then those that are entering the specialty, looking for longevity in the field as a profession. So who's the next owner after the flip? Could be another private equity firm. Goals and timelines could be different. Even those that say, hey, my PE firm owner is amazing right now, they're treating as well. It could be a brand new owner 3-5 years from now. They could sell to a larger healthcare conglomerate. A big healthcare system could buy up the PE-backed practice, could go for an IPO, initial public offering on the stock market, or they could sell to an insurance company. As you guys will hear later here today, some of the insurance companies are the largest employers of physicians in America right now. And you can see this is typically all a game in Healthcare Law Monthly. The PE executives themselves say in one private equity cycle, one critical strategy that PE investors deliberate is the timing of a window of opportunity. So successfully exit an investment at the best possible purchase price without being the last one standing. And it's typically, this is a game of musical chairs. The music goes and people circle around. Typically when debt is cheap and debt is easy to access, everyone's having a good time. When debt is harder to access, they come up with other tactics like Brendan has alluded to, and the music stops and someone's being the last one standing, but it's not the PE firm, it'll be the doctors or the employees at the bottom. And so core practice of medicine, Mitch already talked about this, so I'll kind of skip over this, but AMA enacted this doctrine many, many years ago, basically due to concerns from one, aligned corporations to practice medicine, two, obligation to shareholders may not align with the physician's obligation to his or her patients, and three, employment of a physician by corporation may interfere with the physician's independent medical judgment. And this is really what the theme here today is, CPOM and how do you preserve these doctrines that were enacted many years ago that people have been circumventing. So how are they circumventing it? In a quick one-slide overview, this is how CPOM is circumvented. I'm sure it'll go more in detail later. But they form two entities, a management services organization and a professional medical corporation. And so what it does is the MSO provides administrative and management support to the group's practices. The MSO is the entity that acquires the assets of a well-established platform practice, usually purchased as a percentage of the practice's cash flow. Physicians that are in the acquired practice are usually paid with a combination of upfront cash and equity in MSO. So let's say you get paid $1 million for your practice. Made this number up. Typically, 60% or so, or 50% might get paid as cash. The other 30, 40%, they're forced to reinvest into the group as equity to keep them aligned, or as Mitch likes his term, as captive physicians in the model. So they stick around while the group is flipped and continues to hopefully grow. Meanwhile, the PE-friendly physicians are part of the professional medical corporation, quote unquote, paper owners. And typically there's one head, physician consolidator there who employs the physicians and non-physician practitioners. Continue this model, grow, add-on practices, rinse, repeat, and that's how the process works. But this whole model is how they've been able to navigate the CPOM laws and regulations that are present in over 30 states. Envision lawsuit, I will kind of skip over this because you guys are going to hear more in detail about this, but EM is leading the way, as you guys all know, while pushing back against corporate practice of medicine. And I'm briefly going to go over some brief overview of what are some regulatory updates happening over the last 3-4 years. In general, FTC and DOJ are increasing their scrutiny of PE acquisitions in healthcare. Lena Khan, the chair of the FTC, has vowed a muscular antitrust approach to PE healthcare deals. And then Cantor, who's head of DOJ's antitrust unit, noted PE firms, they hollow out and roll up an industry and essentially cash out and are very much at odds with the law and the very competition that they're trying to protect. And they want to increase enforcement with a multi-pronged approach. So what's happened timeline-wise, in July 2020, starting with the Hart-Scott-Rodino Antitrust Improvement Act, this act requires PE to notify the FTC and DOJ prior to transactions that are more than $94 million. How many doctors' practices are worth more than $94 million? None. So all of these are being acquired under the radar and not being reported with the rules and regulations that are present at present. So hopefully they'll be looking into ways they can monitor this or even decrease this threshold requirement where they do have to report these acquisitions happening. They can have a better eye on the landscape and what's happening. Because right now this allows PE to quietly increase market power and reduce competition under the radar. And then Chopra, who was previous commissioner for the FTC, acknowledged these deficiencies and the need for increased monitoring. Moving on, in January 2021, FTC issued orders to 6 healthcare insurance companies to provide data to retrospectively study physician practice acquisitions over the past 5 years from 15 to 2020 and its effect on competition. I haven't heard anything about that yet, but hopefully we'll see with time what happens from that. Then in January 2022, the FTC DOJ launched a joint public inquiry soliciting input on modernizing merger guidelines to better detect and prevent anti-competitive deals. During this joint public inquiry, this was dominated by doctors' worries over PE deals and their negative impact. Many complained about PE-backed consolidation, CPOM, and detrimental effects on patient care. And then April 2022, FTC DOJ held a listening forum on first-hand effects of mergers and acquisitions, which Mitch here was an invited speaker, and several in the audience spoke as part of the public at that forum. And then in June and October of 2022, FTC took action to protect competition in the vet industry. I know we got one of them back there. And they unanimously approved 2 separate orders against Jab Consumer Partners requiring divestiture of clinics in multiple metro areas where there was too much competition going on from them. The irony is they're looking out, no offense, but we're looking out for the animals. We're not looking out for the humans yet. So I'm hoping that's setting a precedent for further actions in the area. And then in October 22, FTC began investigating PE-backed U.S. anesthesia partners or whether it amassed too much market power in some regional markets. Again, the same month, DOJ enforced Section 2 of the Sherman Act for the first time in decades. This is not related to medicine, but it was when a construction company contractor attempted to monopolize the market by proposing a strategic partnership with its competitor by allocating regional markets between themselves. Now, I don't know how it is in other specialties. In dermatology, we have trade groups with some of these big PE-backed groups. Our big PE-backed trade group is called the Dermatology Practice Support Alliance, and essentially comprised of the 9 or 10 largest PE-backed groups in dermatology, which comprise about 70% of the market share of private equity groups in dermatology. And these groups have been known to essentially sell practices to each other, help consolidate their regional markets they're focusing on, and actually work together in certain avenues as well. So it's a very gray line here on what they're doing. And so we'll see if this Sherman Act enforcement will actually translate to other things that trade groups may be doing out there. Then in January 2023, FTC proposed to ban non-compete clauses. How many of you guys have you heard about them in the room? Non-competes, maybe. Who knows if it'll happen or not, but this will definitely help workers and increase competition. The problem is non-competes for everybody. So if you're a prior practice owner, you may not want to get rid of non-competes because you're trying to protect your practice too. So there's a lot of voices in the pot here. This is not just against big corporations, this is against small mom and pop too. So it's gonna be different voices in the pot here to see if this actually gets over the hill and anything gets done with it. And then lastly, in September 2023, FTC did sue U.S. Anesthesia Partners as a dominant provider of anesthesia services in Texas. And the PE firm, Welsh, Carson, Anderson, Stowe, was also implicated in that also, which is probably it's setting a trend, because as you alluded earlier, Brendan, usually a PE firm tries to dodge the lawsuit. So this is the first, I think, in the recent past where they're being named as well as part of a multi-year anti-competitive scheme to, 1, consolidate anesthesiology practices in Texas, 2, drive up the price of anesthesia services provided to Texas patients, and 3, boost their own profits. And then so switching gears from FTC DOJ, briefly, the White House has been involved in things as well. 3 separate statements, fact statements from the White House in February and October 2022 and September 2023, all about nursing homes. A lot of that's propagated from that study that Brendan alluded to, and essentially proposing federal minimum staffing requirements, tougher enforcement initiatives, and efforts to expand the nursing workforce as well in the states. And then more recently, December 2023, they had another fact sheet released online from the White House. You had to really dig into it because the title you can't tell completely, but it says, administration announces new actions to lower healthcare and prescription drug costs by promoting competition. But if you read further under the main headlines, this is what they want to do in terms of anti-competitive issues. They want to scrutinize these issues and practices. They're launching a cross-government public inquiry into corporate greed in healthcare. They're identifying anti-competitive roll-ups that currently evade antitrust review. They want to increase ownership transparency, which help kind of pull back the curtain to see what's happening, and also help with research studies as well. They want to increase Medicare Advantage transparency. They want to ban non-compete agreements that trap healthcare workers, develop new payment models for doctors, including supporting independent doctors, and improve transparency of hospital charges, because hospitals are not, they're culprits in this as well. And then also in December, sent 2 senators, Whitehouse and Grassley, notified they're spearheading an inquiry in a bipartisan probe of PE's growing role in U.S. healthcare as well. So I'll leave you guys with a few quotes and we'll go into our QA session. Jim Chanos, he's kind of known as the Warren Buffett of short sellers in the markets. He says, but there are companies that can do that besides selling your practice, right? End of the day, this is just an accounting game. It's just simply, it's pay a lump sum up front. We'll keep the doctors for 5 to 7 years. And then Arnold Relman, who was a past New England Journal of Medicine editor-in-chief, he actually passed away from melanoma. He said, how best to ensure that the medical industrial complex serves the interests of patients first and with stockholders second will have to be the responsibility of the medical profession and informed public. That's what we all are doing here today. So thank you.
So before they do the Q&A, we wanted to play a special video for you. Our next speaker wishes that she could be here in person, but due to the legislative calendar and responsibilities in Washington, D.C., she was unable to be. So she recorded her presentation for you, and we're going to play it now. This is U.S. Congresswoman Katie Porter.
Katie Porter. I'm sorry I couldn't join you in person today. Throughout California, doctors are spending less and less time with their patients due to the corporate practice of medicine. Now, I know that everyone here today is likely familiar with this concept due to your work, but our challenge as advocates is to bring more people into our movement. We need to explain terms like corporate practice of medicine, because the reality is that many Americans experience its harms as patients without even realizing it. Here's how we can explain it to someone. Imagine that you've been experiencing some strange symptoms lately. You easily make an appointment with your primary care doctor, who then refers you to a specialist. This is where the problems begin. The specialist you were referred to is part of a large healthcare system. Even though your primary care provider made a referral, it takes you months to get an appointment. When your appointment finally rolls around, you have to spend 20 minutes past your appointment time waiting to even be called back by the nurse. The nurse takes your vitals, leaves you waiting another 20 minutes to see your doctor. You waited months to get an appointment, wasted time in the waiting room, and had a $50 copay, only to have your doctor then spend less than 10 minutes with you. You like the specialist, but leave feeling incredibly frustrated by how little medicine the doctor actually got to practice with you. What you may not see is that your doctor is also frustrated that they can't spend more time with you. But the large healthcare consortium that employs them recently changed its policies to limit the amount of time doctors can spend preparing for appointments, making referrals, doing necessary paperwork, and spending time with patients. As a result, your doctor has back-to-back appointments because others have left practice due to these policy changes. And the health system is in hiring additional staff. When the staffing and schedule is set by a large health system, everybody loses. This is the corporate practice of medicine, where large corporations, such as insurance companies or private equity firms, employ physicians to provide medical services to maximize profit, not provide the best patient care. The most common way patients experience the corporate practice of medicine is through how much or how little time doctors spend with them. Corporations stretch their medical staff thin, cramming doctors' schedules at the expense of both patients and providers. Now let's zoom out and see this on a bigger scale. You think that the healthcare decision you're receiving is a decision that is just between you and your doctor. But wait, there are actually two other entities who are influencing the care you receive. Big insurance, who we all know creates additional hurdles to receiving care. And the large corporation that owns the insurer and hospital at which you receive care. Now you have to navigate the maze of big insurance and healthcare corporations just to reach your doctor. The corporate practice of medicine creates barriers to patients receiving the care they deserve. When you go to the doctor, you want them to be responsive to your individual health needs and act in your best interest. But under the corporate practice of medicine, doctors are constrained and beholden to the corporate interests of shareholders instead of their own medical expertise. Unfortunately, today, the majority, nearly 3/4 of physicians are employed by large corporations. Doctors increasingly have their hands tied. They are forced to make difficult decisions between meeting the requirements imposed on them by their employer and their code of ethics. To make matters worse, corporations silence doctors and threaten to derail their jobs and careers if they speak out for patient safety. I want to share the story of Dr. Ming Lin, who was wrongfully fired for advocating for improved protective gear and safety measures at his hospital in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. During a time when hundreds of thousands of people were dying, the hospital that employed Dr. Lin chose to be selfish. Instead of purchasing personal protective equipment, they terminated one of their doctors to protect their profits. This is unacceptable. Physicians employed by large healthcare corporations don't have protections if they speak out against this kind of corporate abuse. The corporate practice of medicine has infected a whole field of medical fields, including dialysis, nursing homes, primary care, emergency medicine, and the list goes on and on. Private equity has been consolidating medical practices and contaminating healthcare with increasing profit motives for decades, right under our noses. Many states have prohibitions on the corporate practice of medicine, yet the problem is still getting worse. I'm proud that California is leading the way to fight these abuses with a lawsuit against the Envision Healthcare Corporation. Without adequate enforcement, we all lose out. Corporations are going to continue pushing the boundaries and disrupting needed patient medical care unless we act. Just like any market, healthcare functions best when patients have choices. Private equity's consolidation of medical practices and pivot toward profit-driven care harms patients and healthcare workers. Healthcare profits shouldn't come at the expense of patient well-being. We cannot allow private companies to dictate the level of care doctors are able to provide or punish doctors for standing up to their patients. Thank you for inviting me to speak today and joining me in this fight. Together, we can build a healthcare system that delivers the care that Americans need and deserve.
The scenes here, and we have to thank Faith Cleanser, wherever she is, for literally going out to Best Buy and like Verizon last night to get a hotspot because this hotel does not have a Wi-Fi with bandwidth to run Zoom. Okay, so just the fact that we got a little feedback. I'm okay with that. So we have 10 minutes for Q&A. We've got a couple questions from the Zoom, which we're going to try to pipe in verbally so the actual Zoom participants can speak. 10 minutes, 9:25 is going to be the breakout sessions. And here is going to be unionization or organizing. And then the rest of it should be in your handout where you're heading. So we'll end it just a couple minutes before 9:25 so we can get started over there. If you guys have questions, feel free to raise your hands and then we will pass around a mic. And I'm going to try to start with a Zoom question and see if they can speak. Otherwise, I'll read the question for them. Meanwhile, if you guys have questions, pretend there's a mic in the middle and
Yeah,
line
just
up for it.
We can repeat the question.
Yeah, just
so that,
shout
yeah. Were you raising your hand? Yeah.
Yeah, I just wondered if you could comment more about what does it take to get states to actually to get them to enforce the laws they have against the corporate practice of medicine? Why can't we do more to make that happen?
I have some very general, but you might have more specific thoughts on enforcement at the state level.
you're the justice guy.
You're the lawyer.
Yeah. Well, and again, I should just reiterate, I'm speaking in a personal capacity, and I really, there's sort of some natural limits on what I can talk about. I think part of it is just speaking just personally as a lawyer is when you're working in a prosecutorial office, an attorney general's office, a DA's office, or something like that. There's the kind of work the murders and the crimes, and you've got a white collar section that's used to dealing with procurement fraud or something like that, and you know how to do those cases. These laws have never been enforced, to such an extent, as I understand it, some people don't even know who has the authority to enforce them, whether it's in some states, the state attorneys general or the medical boards, or if there's a private right of action or anything like that. Hayden, who's in the back there, who has done much more work on this stuff than I have, will probably have answers to these sorts of things. But part of the job that I think the people in this room will have is educating the enforcers about the power that they have, and explaining to them both the problem and sort of the need for action here, but how you actually go about doing it. So there's going to be an education project that you guys are going to have to do.
I will add that it's a very grassroots effort, and multiple individuals in this room, from Michigan and then Oregon and then Florida, Vicky's somewhere around, they're really paving the way in these states, and all the credit goes to them. And if in other states, if you guys want to pave the way, these are great people to contact and connect with. You can replicate and not completely build from scratch the same efforts. So
We've got maybe a question.
Let me pass
I just
it.
add really quick. So, and you'll hear about it more later, but first of all, California did not sue Envision. The American Academy of Emergency Medicine sued Envision, so that's needed, correct? And to play on your point, and then I'll leave it to our lawyers and stuff to talk more about it, it's the enforcement. We've tried to get this California State Attorney General to take on the case, and they said it's the Board of Medicine, and the Board of Medicine says no, it's the office. There's just all this confusion. I'll let others explain that, but I wanted to add that this isn't theoretical. This is happening in this state right now, and that in fact the state agencies don't know who's going to enforce it and who wants it.
Do we want to go with the person with the microphone just so that the
I
folks
just have
online
a
can hear?
follow-up
Yeah.
to what she said.
Is the confusion
Oh.
actually a lack of will?
Like this?
Yeah.
Yeah. My name's Laura Kinney. I'm a direct care physician in Missouri, and we're one of the states that doesn't have any CPOM laws. The Midwest was pretty white up on that map. So kind of a follow along to what she asked. If we're trying to advocate for a law to pass and it's a de novo piece of legislation, who could we consult with so that the legislation is written in such a way that it does define who has authority, so that we don't repeat the same mistakes that these states that already have laws, but they can't even enforce them. Even though we're behind the eight ball, we have an opportunity to write a better law.
Well, I point again to Hayden, who's the real expert on
Hayden,
this. So
raise your
he's going to have a
hand
bunch
so
of
we can all
work coming
bother
out of this
you.
conference. So,
Who's Hayden?
Hayden Rick,
He's hiding.
He's going to be
You can
talking
stand
a
up.
little- yeah.
The next session is
Gonna tell us that.
Yeah.
Perfect.
So
I don't know.
we all have to talk to him. I think that's part of it. I guess I'd also add there, I mentioned in my section, there are a couple organizations, Americans for Financial Reform and American Economic Liberties Project are just two of them. Historically, those have just been policy advocacy organizations, but I think I've seen them getting increasingly interested in doing legal advocacy. So AELP just hired, I think, their first legal director. So they're building a body of expertise on this sort of stuff. So I think if you marry some of the sort of sector-specific stuff that folks in this room have with some of the institutional experience that these organizations have, I think there might be some really fruitful work done.
How much of a problem are consulting firms like McKinsey impacting on this? I mean, I'm just listening to when McKinsey comes to town. It's frightening, and I just wonder how much money they're extracting from the system and getting away with.
Well, to my knowledge, I mean, McKinsey as a consulting firm is not extracting money directly from these buyouts. They're getting paid consultant fees to all the intermediaries that are conducting the transactions about the timing or the right people to go after or the market shares they want to go after and get. So they're definitely profiting off of it, but usually it's not off the direct transaction. It's about bringing two different stakeholders together to complete the transaction.
You got one question for the Attorney General is, what gets the attention of the Attorney General? Is it a newspaper article like the New York Times, in Mount Washington State where they sue the nonprofit hospital about like their population, or is it the governor calling the Attorney General, is the state legislator coming to, what gets the attention of the Attorney General to pursue?
That's a good question. So the question for folks online is if I can restate, and this is a celebrity, Dr. Ming Lin right here. So what gets the attention? You said Attorney General. Maybe I'll rephrase it as because this is primarily a state level issue. A state Attorney General or a district attorney or something like that. Again, I think part of it is, maybe I'm naive here. And sort of biased from my profession, but I do think that most lawyers are in government are mostly trying to do the right thing. A lot of the career people there are really trying to enforce the law and make their communities better. But a lot of it is coming from a place of ignorance, which is lack of awareness of this law, lack of awareness of how to enforce the law, lack of awareness about who enforces the law. So part of it is, at the risk of repetition, is just an understanding of sort of giving them the mechanics for how to do these sorts of things. I think your general point is right, which is, anybody's sort of resources as a prosecutor or a governor or a regulator are extremely limited, and you have to choose which things are going to be most impactful. So I think humanizing this problem, I think, is going to be really, really useful for folks that are thinking about advocacy at the state or local level here, which is explaining that this is not a technical violation, sort of a failure to check a box or something like that, but to explain in very specific terms how patients and how communities are going to be harmed. I think if you present that to folks in a way that's digestible, is going to be really effective. The last thing that I say is, one of the challenges that we've got is, I'm coming from one profession, you guys are coming from another. We all have our own jargon, unfortunately, and I think sometimes lawyers and doctors talk past each other a little bit. So I'll just say I've received the 20-page single space complaints from folks as I was researching my book. It's overwhelming. I don't understand it. If there's a way to do the 2-page version of it, I think can often be just as effective or more effective for a busy, local level DA or something like that that's trying to understand this issue. So trying to make it digestible is going to be really helpful.
I'm just going to talk a little bit for the folks on the chat, the Zoom. First of all, if anyone wants to speak from Zoom, do the little hand raising thing. We'll try to actually pipe you in so you can say things out loud. Otherwise, we'll repeat some questions from there. And then thank you for repeating questions for any speakers. If somebody's speaking without a microphone, the folks on Zoom can hear. But we had one question I think would be great from a Zoom participant, Christopher Garofalo. This is a PE heavy talk. We're talking about the corporate practice medicine overall, which the CPOM prohibitions originated before really the concept of insurance, or at least before insurance was a big thing, and before CMS. So prior authorization, insurance companies, those are lay entities affecting the practice of medicine, and is CPOM in my view. The question is, your description of private equity makes it sound like the PE people are the only ones who win in these deals. If so, if this is the case, I'm not sure what SWFs was, but like pension plans and retirement plans, why do they participate in these deals? Why are they investing?
I've got my answer, but do you have yours?
Yeah, I mean, they're just chasing, well, the pension plans are chasing, profits for their people that they need to be supporting with the pensions. So like in dermatology, there's at least 2 or 3 big PE-backed derm groups that are backed by Canadian pension plans, teacher pension plans, government employee pension plans. So those profits are leaving the American health ecosystem, or the ecosystem in general, and going to Canada to support pension plans. And the simple answer is they're chasing it because they feel the stock market was not giving them enough returns, and they want something better than 3, 4, 5%. And PE will often promise that. I mean, they may not always deliver it, but they promise that to the pension plans. So
It's a great question. I know we're running up on time here. There are definitely a lot of examples out there where the private equity firm wins, the company loses, and the other investors lose, what are called the limited partners. So the pension funds, the sovereign wealth funds, and so forth, where, I mentioned earlier, Toys R Us, for instance, I think essentially wiped out the limited partners investment, though there was reporting at Axios that the private equity firms actually walked away just fine. So there are lots of examples like that. There are also a fair number of examples where everybody wins, or all the investors, the private equity firms and the limited partners, win at the expense of the portfolio company, because you're able to extract a fair amount of money or make short-term gains that hurt the company in the long term. The really interesting thing that I've seen sort of as it's moving from the academic world into the actual investing world is there's a growing body of research out there saying that private equity returns, when you account for fees, actually aren't better than investing in the stock market. So you kind of ask yourself, well, then why the heck are pension funds and sovereign wealth funds and foundations continuing to invest in that? I've heard a lot of different explanations, sort of from the conspiracy theorists who are saying, oh, it's a sort of corrupt interaction between pension funds and private equity firms. I think that has been disputed or discredited at some level. I think the more credible explanation, when I talked with folks that are advising pension funds, is they say, right now it's a herd mentality that, okay, this is achieving rough parity with the stock market, or maybe it's even a little worse than the stock market, but no pension fund manager is going to stick their neck out and decrease their exposure to the private equity market, because they don't want to look like the idiot that did that and then lost a bunch of money. So it'll be interesting to see what happens now in a world of rising interest rates, where it's a lot harder to make money on a leveraged buyout, whether that ultimately has a ripple effect into the pension fund and sovereign wealth fund world, and they grow more skeptical of this industry. And then, I know we're 2 minutes over, what effect that has on where private equity firms get their money, and whether they put, sort of double down on the insurance business, on the private credit business, on the 401k business, and so forth. So it's going to be a very interesting few years.
We are right up to 9:27. We're pushing into the next session. I'll read a question here, and I think I'll just kind of answer it very quickly so we can move on to the next session. But a question from Zoom from Nick. What can one do with privately owned family companies like Epic Corporation that do not necessarily use private equity strategies but have an immense impact on patient well-being? The thing I'll say there is, if they're really influencing the practice of medicine, which the practice of medicine is influenced in a lot of different ways than simply employing physicians in our modern era, but that is a lay company that is not the actual physicians. Lay just means they're not physicians, they're not licensed to practice medicine. So I don't have the exact answers on how to fix that, but we do know that data and control of data is a big way that these lay corporations, with Epic also has a lot of deals and essentially contracts with a lot of other lay corporations that are controlling the practice of medicine. So the CPOM is a very broad concept, and it's a lot more complicated than when the concept came up, when it was basically cash pay, which we'll talk about direct primary care as well, between a physician and a patient. The only way that it was influenced, the practice of medicine was influenced at that point, was basically employment by corporations, which we are at the point of 74% or more physicians employed by lay corporations. That includes hospitals, and we'll talk about that too. Any other last remarks before we move on?
No, thank you so much.
You're self-employed, you pick your own EMR.
And there's that. So yes, you can. We will have. So we're going to go to the breakout sessions right now. For time that we're kind of losing, because we're just a tiny bit behind. Just please be back in this room for the plenary sessions, like 3 minutes, 2 minutes beforehand. So we will get back on time for each plenary session. In here is going to be, I believe, unionization and organizing. Yep. And then section medical education and residency in Salon 2. In the private practice track, Salon 3. This should all be in your handouts. And then Salon 1 is advocacy, physician advocacy. All right.
Good job.
Hey, really great.
Oh, yeah. In fact, can I get your slides?
Yeah.
Mr. Moderator, this is Lucas. Can you make me co-host? I'm going to share my screen and then show everybody how to get to all the different rooms. So there are various breakout rooms, and I'll show you how to get them. If you were already here in the beginning, you can move.
I'm a doctor.
Please see if you can unmute, and you can make me co-host right now, and then I'll be able to share my screen.
Oh, well, then you really talk
Yeah, when you said that, I was like, I grew up in well, I need this. Yeah,
I'll come back in a everybody wants to jump into a breakout room, you leave Zoom, jump into another room, and then join Zoom there. In a moment, I will show you how to do that if you have not already seen how to do that. I'll be right back. I know it's hard to hear right now, but we'll sort this out.
I knew it was
back in Bangor, and I went visited his practice.
I don't even know what direct practice is.
Well, basically just like that. That's just
Hi, everyone. This is Lucas here with Tech Support, and there's going to be a few breakout rooms happening, and I'll show you how to move yourself to those rooms. If you were here at the top of the hour when the conference began, then you already know how to do this, and you're going to leave Zoom, jump to the next room, and open Zoom when you get there. I'll share my screen for those who are not familiar with the process. And you can also unmute and ask any questions. I'll pause the recording here also.